So this morning I want to continue with the questions of Garuda that we have been studying since our satsangs in October. So when we met in December, we discussed the third question of Garuda, and he asked his teacher, what is the highest joy? What is the highest source of joy? And we discussed the teacher's answer there. Santa Milana sama sukha jaganahi. There is no joy or no source of joy comparable to relationships with santas, which we spoke of as virtuous people, virtuous human beings. Santa Milana sama sukha jaga mahi. And just to highlight one or two points from that discussion, in our Hindu tradition, and then of course in so many other traditions, I mentioned and spoke of the fact that virtue is essential for a meaningful life, for fulfilled living. And we talked about the fact that we have these four goals in our Hindu tradition. The first one is dharma, or virtue, which is the foundation of everything else. You know, artha without dharma, prosperity without virtue, is regarded not only as incomplete but also as dangerous in our Hindu tradition. So virtue is necessary for joy, for meaningful and fulfilled life. So, without getting too political, because we always appreciate prosperity. But if you take the perspective, the larger perspective of the Hindu tradition, it is not only about the economy. It is not only about the economy, it's also about the formation of good human beings. It's about the nurturing and the cultivation of virtue. So, the second point I emphasize is that given the fact that virtue is a central goal and life is incomplete without the cultivation of virtue, we also spoke of the fact that we learn what it means to be virtuous from significant people in our lives, especially those who are elders in our families, in our communities, those who are mentors, those who are exemplars. Virtue is something that is learned, it is learned behavior, it is cultivated behavior, and we learn from those who are significant in our lives. And the best teachers of virtue, of course, are those whom the text speaks of as the santas. The word santa itself means a virtuous person, a person who is full of goodness. So the next logical question, of course, which is question 4 in the text, is who is a virtuous person? If the text is saying, that relationships with virtuous people are the source of joy in our lives, then of course the next question is, who is the santa? How do you describe the santa? And one of the beautiful things about this discussion is the way in which the teacher gives very brief and well-chosen definitions in all of his answers. So he describes the santa in reply to the question, who is the santa? He says, para upkara vachana manakaya santa sahaja subhava. Para upkara vachana manakaya santa swabhava. Santa swabhava. So a virtuous person is someone who is committed to the well-being of others. This is what the term para upkara means. A person committed to the flourishing of other human beings, to the well-being of others, and of course mentions in these 3 areas, vachana, word, mana in thought and in action. In thought, word, and action, thought, word, and deed. A commitment, one who is committed to the well-being of others. And so what we see here, in mentioning these three, committed in thought, word, and deed, is what the tradition means by harmony or an integrated human being. This is the example of an integrated human being where there is consistency in mana, vachana, and kaya. These three are not separated; they flow harmoniously into each other. But what is interesting, after describing the virtuous person as someone committed to others in thought, word, and deed, the teacher adds sahaj swabhava. Sahaj means natural, innate. Swabhava means one's nature. So this is the innate disposition of the virtuous person. It is the person's swabhava. We use that term to say so. It is the intrinsic nature of the virtuous person to be concerned about the flourishing or the well-being of others. If you think of what does it mean, what do we mean when we say something is intrinsic or innate? I mean, you can think of many examples. If you are, let's say you are walking with your child, on the pavement, and the child, suddenly tugs from your hand and dashes onto the street, and you see an oncoming car. You don't pause to think. A parent doesn't pause to think. A parent would immediately rush, regardless of the danger involved, and try to save that child. There's no hesitation. There's no pause for reasoning. Should I risk my own life to save my child? We will do it. This is called sahaj swabhava. This is a parent's sahaj swabhava. This is the innate disposition, the intrinsic disposition of the parent. So similarly, he describes the virtuous person as having this kind of intrinsic disposition to doing good for others. But, to be realistic as human beings, all of us, this is the ideal. This integration of thought and word and action is the ideal towards which we must aspire. But it doesn't come overnight. It doesn't come overnight. It is something that requires work. It requires what we speak of in our tradition as sadhana, practice, sadhana, practice. So what at some point requires practice eventually becomes spontaneous. Spontaneous. My guru used to tell the example of the cook in the temple who liked to sing. So very often, when he was cooking in the temple, he would sing, and this obviously brought him very great joy. So people used to speak of him as the cook who sings. We have a cook in our temple who's always singing. But first and foremost, he was the cook who sang. That's how they spoke of him. But, he started to sing, and then people said, you sing very well. Why don't you learn music? So he didn't give up his job as a cook, but he took some music classes, and then he would still sing when he was cooking. But his singing got very beautiful because now he was a trained singer, and he would sing in the ragas. And so my teacher said, and suddenly people started to speak of him differently. They said, we have a singer who cooks. From being the cook who sings, with some effort, he now became the singer who works in the kitchen as a cook. So singing became, sahaj swabhava. It became sort of his natural, innate, spontaneous nature. But he had to do the sadhana, the practice. So, there is a very, thinking of my guru also, he used to speak often of this stotra from Samaveda. And it's a very profound stotra. It's called Setum Stara. Setu means the bridge, crossing the bridge. The stotra about crossing the bridge. And a bridge is something that helps us to get from one point to another. Usually, it helps us to negotiate some territory that is hard to cross without the bridge. So that may be a raging river, it may be a lake, a bridge across the lake, but some difficult terrain or some difficult geographical features. But the bridge helps us to get across a deep gorge or a river. It makes the crossing possible. So this stotra, this hymn in Samaveda is called Crossing the Bridge. Crossing the Bridge. So I just focus on a part of it, but this is the main text where the teacher just says, Danena adanam tara. Akrodhena krodham tara. Sraddhaya asraddham tara. Satyena anritam tara. Setum stirtva swargacha jyotirgacha. I just want to focus on the first two lines. So the stotra identifies certain challenges that we want to overcome as human beings and points out how we can overcome these challenges. This is the bridge, the teacher says. But so I'll focus on danena adanam tara, akrodhena krodham tara. So danam is exactly what is para-upkar. Dhanam is generosity, the disposition to give. And of course, krodha is anger. Akrodha is freedom from anger. So, minimally in this stotra, we recognize, when you use a bridge, you recognize where you want to go to, right? You recognize the destination. But when you recognize the destination, you're not there yet. But you know what the destination is. You know what the ideal, in this case, you know what the ideal is. The ideal is to grow in generosity. Para-upkar, vachanamanakaya. The ideal is to be free from destructive anger. So you recognize that. But we don't always, once we recognize the ideal, once we recognize the destination, it doesn't mean that we have achieved it. We still have to work on it. So there may be, within us, there may be addanena, right? Dhanam, the opposite of dhanam is addanena. Thoughts and feelings that are not generous. Non-generous feelings. And of course, krodha would be, intense and destructive feelings of anger. So, we can't, in this stotra, while the ideal is this integration that the teacher spoke about, kayena, thought, mana, vachana, speech and action, that's the ideal. That integration is the ideal. Sort of becoming spontaneous. Sahaj Swabha, that's the ideal, but we're not there immediately. We still have ungenerous thoughts, or we still are subject to easily instigated anger. What do we do? So this Rishi here is suggesting that we can't wait until we achieve this integration. But one way to achieve this integration is to know what is the right thing. So we know that the right thing is to be generous. So even when we don't feel generous, Even when we may not have generous thoughts, we should still be generous. We should still, at least because you know what the ideal is. You know what the ideal is. So you can't wait to say, well, I'm going to be generous only when I feel generous. You see? Even when you don't feel generous, be generous. And it's an interesting psychological insight here, I think. And this is what here is where I feel this deep psychological insight is. So, in our tradition, we have these, in sadhana, we have the ideal of controlling the mind, which is called shama, and controlling the sense organs, the body, called dhamma. Normally, truthfully, we assume that if I achieve control of the mind, I will achieve control of the body. But here it's suggesting that by controlling of the body, I can also control the mind. In other words, by being generous, even when I'm not feeling generous, I am performing, it's a form of sadhana. It's a transformative practice. Because I know what is the right thing to do. Even though I may not feel right, I can do what is right. You see what I mean? That's an interesting insight. I can't wait until I achieve this kayena vacha manasa integration. But if I know what is right, I should do it even when I don't feel to do it. When I feel angry, right, I can still speak words that are not angry. And that practice will also have an inner transformative effect. So, ad-danena danam tara. Overcome the absence of generosity by the practice of generosity. Overcome anger by the practice of its opposite. In Sanskrit, it's also called pratipaksha bhavana, cultivating the opposite. So this is how we can achieve the ideal, by doing what is right, even when perhaps we are not psychologically there yet. But the goal is eventually to cultivate this sort of sahaj swabhava, where the act, the thought, and the word are in perfect integrity. But we can't be harsh on ourselves. We're not going to get there immediately without, mindfulness, mindful sadhana about it. But it's always, I think it's a very useful insight to keep in mind. Now, the teacher's definition of virtue doesn't stop there. So the first part of his definition is para upkar vachana mana kaya, to be committed to the well-being of others in thought, in word and deed, naturally, sahaj swabhava. That's the ideal towards which we want to aspire, naturally, without having to deliberate about it. As I said, like a parent rushing to save a child from danger. But he adds something very important, very profound. In the next line, he says about the virtuous person, Santa sahahi dukha parahita lagi. Santa sahahi dukha parahita lagi. And he says, such a person, such a santa, such a virtuous person will also endure suffering for the sake of the other. Santa sahahi dukha. The virtuous person will also endure suffering if that's required for the well-being and the flourishing of others. Santa sahahi dukha parahita lagi. He talks about the Santa, but I want to focus more on the Santa. So, in a sense, he's answering the question. The Santa is someone committed to others. The the good of others in thought, word, and deed, how far should the Santa go? Does that stop when there is some price? Where is there a boundary to the practice of virtue? And he says, no, that a virtuous person will also bear suffering if the end of that suffering is the well-being of others. So the willingness to suffer, in other words, the boundary of virtue doesn't stop where it doesn't cost me anything. That's too easy. It's too easy. The test is the willingness also to suffer for the other. And I'm not claiming, as I said before, that this is an easy ideal. We always, as human beings, there is a fact of self-interest. But if we are, at least, I always say, even when we can't achieve the ideal, let us know what the ideal is. We should not reduce the ideal to our own defective state of being. We should recognize what the ideal is, even when we can't achieve it. We should know at least what is that ideal towards which we must walk, towards which we must grow. And why is this important? That the teacher adds that Santa Sahi Dukha Parahitalagi, that virtue will also endure suffering. And we can see, so many examples of this. However we might interpret these figures, I think the figures, in history that we look to as embodiments of virtue demonstrated this quality to even take on suffering for the well-being of the other. Whatever you might think, however we might look at the life of the Christian community, just celebrated the birth of Jesus. But here was someone who exemplified that willingness. That's the whole Christian theology is about that. Willingness to suffer for the other. People like Martin Luther King probably knew, the day he launched his first march, that the end would be, what happened? What actually happened to him? He was taking great risks. It was a great risk. Right? Gandhi, MLK, Jesus exemplified Santa Sahahi Para Dukha, this willingness to take the risk for the other as a mark of virtue. Without that, everything becomes transactional. As I read this text here and all of the descriptions of the Santa, and I hope that as I talk, because he continues to talk about the Santa in the next question, as we talk about the Santa, I hope we can all see it as the ideal towards which we must aspire. We're all called to become Santas. This is the invitation, and we're all capable of it. We're all capable of it. But this is what we are called to become in this world. And what is also interesting here, as the teacher describes this person of virtue, the Santa, whose presence, he says, brings so much joy to us. He doesn't mention anywhere that the Santa is looking for any particular personal outcome, any personal benefit. He says, who's a Santa? Para Uppkara Vachana Manakaya, one who committed to the well-being of others. Not that, and doesn't mention that the person is looking for any benefit for himself or herself. Just naturally, natural self-giving generosity. And when he says also that the Santa is willing to even suffer for the other, doesn't mention that the Santa is looking for any kind of reward. So this is important because the understanding of virtue here is that it is non-transactional. The Santa is not virtuous because he's calculating some benefit for himself or herself. It is sahaj svabhava. He or she is good because it is good to be good. Good is superior. This is the superior way of being. And of course, as I said, we can't practice virtue only when there are no personal risks involved. And so the teacher concludes this particular point, this particular answer, by saying that the world needs people like that. Interesting. There's a crying need in the world for santas, for such embodiments of virtue. And he gives a very beautiful example. Santa Udaya Santata Sukhari Vishwa Sukhada Jimi Indu Tamari. Santa Udaya Santata Sukhakari Vishwa Sukhada Jimi Indu Tamari. He says, the presence of such people, even though few in number, in a community, in a world, who embody this ideal of commitment to others, non-transactional commitment to others, they are like the sun that makes life possible. Their presence can only be compared to sunshine, without which nothing grows, nothing flourishes, in the absence of which everything is dead, lifeless. A world without such persons is like a world without sunshine. Such people who are committed to each other, to each other's well-being. This is, of course, in the Ramayana, but if you look into other texts, it's the same. Sri Krishna says that in Bhagavad Gita is a very beautiful section where he says, I have nothing personal to accomplish. I have not already accomplished, but yet I am active in the world. Loka Sangraha. What Bhagavad Gita called Loka Sangraha. The universal common good is the same as Parupkar. There are no boundaries, there are no barriers, there is no place that the virtuous person will not go to overcome suffering. So I think, this is an ideal, it's a very beautiful ideal, it is one towards which we should all aspire. I think we can all grow, even in small steps, to this ideal of becoming the Santa. It's my own ideal. I hope it becomes the ideal. There are very extensive sections of this text that go back again and again to who is the Santa. And the Santa is not someone else. It is what we're all capable of becoming. This is what our aspiration should be. A religious tradition is not just something that we should take pride in, but it is something that is meant for our transformation also. And that's the primary purpose of it, is that it is to transform us into a more meaningful, which is also a more joyful way of being. We must not lose sight that that's what it exists for, to bring about that transformation within all of us. So, with these words, I will stop. The next question is an important one, like all of the questions, because he asks, what is the highest virtue? What is the highest ethical virtue? And then he gives the answer that we will discuss in our satsang